Hello everyone, welcome to this live stream with my friend Ben Wilson. I am Vincent Go, Community Manager and Technical Artist at Algorithmic. Today, sadly, Wes is not here because it's Memorial Day in the US, so he can rest a bit. So Ben Wilson is going to be with us for quite a long time. It's an in-depth live stream, so I'm suspecting like maybe more than 1 hour for sure. So Ben, before to start, maybe you can introduce a bit yourself.
Yeah, I'm Ben Wilson. I'm a material artist at Ubisoft Stockholm.
Cool.
I moved over to Stockholm a few months back. Prior to that, I was at Machine Games. And yeah, prior to that, I was actually at Ubisoft.
Ubisoft,
again, yeah, I was down at Massive.
So Ubisoft, Machine Game, Ubisoft.
Yeah, Ubisoft again.
But you are not Swedish.
No, I'm not Swedish.
Yeah. Your Swedish is perfect, but you are not Swedish, right?
Well, shamefully, I've lived in Sweden for 4 years and cannot speak Swedish. But no, I'm from the UK originally.
Okay, cool. And you have been using Substance Designer for quite a while right now?
Must be about 4 years actually. Yeah.
Cool, perfect. So before to start, so we have been doing this at home, we can say almost. So we are going to show you a bit. I'm going to take the control and show you a bit the Ben Wilson last drop. So basically we did, if you go in the website, you can see one of the latest user story, which is awesome actually. It's a lot of materials made with love by you. Could you explain a bit where the inspiration comes from?
Yeah, so when this kind of project came up, you know, I was you guys were very open about the subject matter and what I could do, so it was up to me really to propose an idea. So my first step was to look through kind of my inspiration folder, just stuff I've collected over the years. And as I was kind of sorting through that folder, I kind of landed on these two areas of kind of more architectural type materials and then these sort of strange abstract kind of materials. And I really wanted to do both. So I've tried to develop a set that kind of incorporates both things that I was seeing in those materials.
That's really cool, honestly. Lots of stuff, as you said, like some stuff which are more architectural, and then we have you made some stuff which are way more organic, like these ones. All this stuff are available on Substance Source. I think the link right now are not in the description, but we are going to put it later on. And if you go on Substance Source, right now you can go within the collection. And if you go to Signature Collection, you have all of them. If you are not aware, you have the 3D viewer directly in Substance Source. So it will take a few seconds to load. So you can directly preview before to download and even change the color. So I will put a nice pink because I think it's necessary. But more seriously, you can. The good thing is right now you can test the variation before to download. So we are going directly to put your graph. I think it's here, and I let you talk about this. So let's go ahead.
Yeah. So we're going to go through this graph here, the concrete Clover ones. And should I just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead. Just explain maybe where the inspiration comes from this one.
Yeah, it was largely coming from the images that I saw. There was a particular reference that very much matched this, so I tried to actually hit that reference as closely as possible. What I tried to do though with some of the exposed parameters, which we'll go through what all of these settings are doing, but I tried to have a lot of parameters that are specific to the pattern and the design. And this is something I've tried to do throughout the entire set. Okay, so I guess I'll just jump straight in. You can largely, I'll give a kind of a brief overview on like how you can read this graph. It generally starts from sort of left to right. And then there's these kind of channels that run horizontal. So along the top here, we have predominantly height information that runs all the way along. And then we have some base color, down here, and then the roughness along the bottom.
Cool. How did you manage to organize this kind of graph? Because it's really we can see the steps, surface and damages, debris again, dirt. How does it come from? Where does it come from?
Yeah, so one thing I try to do sort of mentally when I'm breaking down a material or thinking about how to build it, I try to think about them as kind of like modules that you sort of plug and play on top. So, for example, most of this is to do with pattern creation. And then we'll have like some surface and damaging, and you'll see that these are kind of organized vertically, where we've got some height information to do the surface, but then the base color and the roughness are also correlated. And the same with the debris. We have the height coming in as well as the base color and the roughness. And this is kind of just how I try to sort of compartmentalize and break down the material.
Cool. Just in case, if you know, I'm looking at the same time at the chat on the live stream. So if you guys have questions, we won't answer directly, but every maybe 10 minutes we'll take a pause to take the question. Just don't forget to tag us at Substance so we know that it's a question. Because we won't read everything, but we will look through the questions. So don't hesitate if you have questions through the graph.
Okay, so we'll begin with, I started this graph by first defining the main pattern sort of outline and shape. And this setup is very simple. I really just took a polygon here. I'm transforming it up here so that the root kind of loosely sits at the base of the shape. And then the splatter circle is I'm using to, rotate this pattern around. And then this polygon here is just to fill that gap.
Cool.
What's kind of important with this setup is I've down-resed the output size. And that's because this is going to get plugged into a tile sampler later, and you don't need all that resolution. Okay,
so for the sake of performance.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. I also have set the output format to 8-bit. Anytime I don't actually need the 16 bits per channel. Again, this is just an optimization. So as I was looking at this this material, one of the things that I was kind of noticing that I wanted to try and incorporate is like we essentially have this kind of ridge here and a gradient going down towards the edge. So the approach I took for this was to build like a profile for this. I've got a node here that helps us visualize what we're doing. So yeah, my approach was to build a profile here. There's 3 arms to the pattern, so I know I need 3 gradients. I then wanted to rotate that shape or convert it into a circular shape.
So you know which node do you use to do this?
Yeah, I'm using the Cartesian topola node, and we can get into the nitty gritty of this.
Sure.
The kind of overall approach I wanted to take is, we have our profile here. I then convert it to a circular shape, and then this information is multiplied over the top of the pattern. So as I mentioned, I knew I had 3 arms, so I needed 3 gradients. Then there's also this kind of crease here that runs along on the edge of the gradient. So the way I then achieved that was using the curve node. I just added a sample point along the curve, and you can see how that changes the profile.
Yeah.
To add that crease. I'll just skip this node for now. We'll cover this in a moment.
And the node that you are plugging each time is just explain. It's a preview node, so you just visualize.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't explain. Yeah, this is just a custom node I've made that just lets me plug in, a height map, and then I can just right-click, drag and drop on the viewport to visualize what I'm doing.
That's cool.
So yeah, then I'm using the kind of see into polar nodes to convert that information into a disk. You'll notice though that we have this weird pinching in the middle, and that's what this blend node's doing. So I'm just taking a linear gradient here, blending it on top with screen, and that just serves to fade the tip. So now when I convert it to a circular shape, we remove that weird pinching. This transform here, you can see it just slightly offsets the pattern, and that's just because when I convert it to a circular shape, I just needed it to line up. So if we bypass this node, you can see it's just slightly off axis. So that's just to line it up. But one of the issues here is we now have this kind of weird information on the outside. So we need to remove that and make sure that we're producing a clean mask. So the way that I approached that was to dilate the values based on the pattern shape, and then auto levels it so that we're just left with a full 0 to 1 gradient without any of that weird circle stuff.
Cool.
So one of the issues with the pattern shape itself is that these edges here, they've got a bit of filtering on them, and to produce clean results with the distance node, what we actually need is this like binary mask here, and also we need to have the mask just slightly inside of the pattern, so that when we do dilate the values, we're actually dilating the values we want, and not like some bad value out here.
Exactly.
So the way I've done this is, I've taken the pattern shape, I'm blurring it slightly just to soften this edge, and then using the histogram scan to produce with a contrast of 1 and a very low position to produce a mask. And you can see here how it slightly goes inside the shape. So that produces the mask that we need, which is then just multiplied on top. And here I then just expose that to the user.
Okay.
And we can take a quick look at kind of what that effect does. So if I just quickly show, so the pattern depth is, if we don't multiply that on top, it's a very flat surface. And if we multiply it in, it dips.
That's cool.
The gradients.
I have 2 questions for you. One is from Alice, who asks, how did you come by making this geometry? Is there a certain workflow to make any repeatable forms into a material? Curious to know the steps when making it. So first, you are going to eat a lot of French accent. Sorry about that. So yes, if you can answer to this first one.
So the question is,
how did you come to this shape, and if you have any recommendation we can say for repeatable shape like this?
Well, actually, this is this shape in particular was quite awkward because the kind of ratio is non-square, and this is one of the things that I struggled with using the tile samplers, and we'll get to that bit in a moment. So unfortunately, this it isn't very procedural. Like you can't change the number of the arms in this pattern shape and then it would automatically propagate. I built this pattern to work with this with these tile samplers. Okay. And I'm not sure how you could go about automating this. This would be very tricky. This particular pattern shape is just awkward.
Especially when the ratio between width and height is awkward. It's hard to find. You have to find a mathematical relationship between both. And if you don't have it, it has to be.
But the reference that I was trying to hit had this pattern, so it was that's the material that I wanted to build.
Okay. And a second question, which is more personal, it was, what was some of your biggest troubles when you first started with Substance Designer? It's Garrett was that.
Let's see. Definitely color information was a really tough one, and we'll also get into this because I've focused a lot on trying to solve color. But yeah, building good color information was particularly tough. I also remember finding it very difficult sort of understanding how height data relates to each other. Okay. By that I mean, like, I'm looking at the histogram scan, and you can kind of visualize this as 3D space, like a side profile of 3D space. So down here, you know, this is the very base. You know, this is like maybe 0 centimeters in space, and then this goes up to maybe 10 centimeters or whatever. And once I kind of realized that and started thinking about the grayscale values as actual depth, then blending data together suddenly became a lot easier.
Okay. Yeah, you are using a lot the histogram to visualize this. We are going to see that.
Exactly. And a node like this that helps you kind of visualize what you're doing is also really useful.
Yeah, a visualizer like this, that's something we should add by default maybe at some point.
Yeah, we can have a look inside it. It really is just I just take the inputs and then generate height, normal, and then there's just all of the other inputs on switches, so you can choose them. Otherwise, they're just flat values.
That's cool.
So it's not a complicated node at all. So let's look at the next one, the pattern cone depth. Here we go. So unlike the pattern depth, the cone depth does something a little bit similar, except it's a cone shape. So here we can see what that's doing. And that setup was a lot more simple. It is just a cone shape that's multiplied on top, and you know, I expose the pattern cone. Again, I've reduced the output size because this information is a sort of a nice soft gradient, so you just don't need the full resolution.
Definitely.
So coming back to the question that we had before about like this particular pattern and putting it into the tile generators. So we have our pattern shape. I then put that into the tile generators to distribute the pattern. And one of the issues with this is this particular pattern doesn't work or tile with odd numbers. So if we have a look here, you can see on odd numbers it doesn't tile at all. So this is one of the issues that I struggled with this particular pattern. So I tried a few solutions on like how do I expose this to the user and not have the graph break.
Yeah.
And you know, there were I first tried exposing these on a separate slider and then have it like automatically work out even numbers and stuff like this. But then you would end up with weird situations where, like, if this is 8 and then this is like 12, and then our shape is like really distorted.
Yeah.
So then I was thinking, well, maybe I could just expose these both to the user, but then you can't ensure that it's actually going to be an even number. So instead, to keep everything simple, I decided to just predefine some different sizes. So here I have a small shape, a medium, and a large. And then I just put this into a multi-switch and expose that as a drop-down for the user.
Okay.
So the other thing that was awkward about this particular shape is because it is a non-square input, like some of these numbers here are kind of funky. Like they're not nice, clean numbers, and this makes it very hard when you're wanting to like automate things and stuff like that. So that was another reason why this graph is this pattern. But other than that, other than the X and Y amount, these tile samplers are just duplicates of each other. So they share all the same settings. Okay, so moving on. So I then wanted to look at adding a bit of damage, like chip damage to the edges and stuff like this. So let's turn up the damage amount so we can see it a little bit better. So here you can see that what this setup is doing is adding this kind of chip on the very edges. And this setup is a very common setup that I use all the time, and the kind of core idea of it is we take some kind of noise data and then we're subtracting that from the height map to control how much I'm using a histogram scan.
Okay.
So if we create a scan here, you can see we can use the position as a means to kind of determine how much of this noise data should be present. But the problem with just this noise data, right, is that it's just going to be all over the place. So what we want to do is modulate it by some gradient that represents the pattern,
yeah,
and fades off towards the center. So we need this kind of mask. So the way that I went about doing that was, well, it's actually just the cone shape, right, with multiplied over the pattern and then inverted. So I've got my kind of gradient that I need. I'm running it through the tile samplers again. Again, these are exact duplicates of the one above. And that goes into the multi-switch. We're doing auto levels here just to make sure we're using the full 0 to 1 range. And this is a very common trick as well, because every time you have some kind of data that you want to use, it's good to know your values of 0 and 1, because then you can ensure that your blending is going to be correct. And, but one of the issues with this input data at the moment is we have this kind of black line left over from the tile samplers, and I wanted to get rid of that because I want a very clean mask. So how I went about doing that was to dilate the values again, using the distance node. So I needed a mask that I could dilate with, and that is just a random grayscale map. Again, these are the tile samplers with the same settings, and then I'm just using an edge detect. So this gives me a nice clean dilated mask without any of that weird black outline. So there's my gradient. So I then just overlay it with the noise, and then the histogram scan to control the amount. So on the position slider, I've exposed this, exposed the damage amount, and I'm actually lerping between two values. And this is because, as we saw, as we change this position slider, this very quickly becomes kind of like useless information.
Yeah.
It's only really this bottom end that we care about. Let me plug this in, this is a bit clearer. So instead of having the user type in these awkward numbers, I instead lerp between two numbers, which these are just eyeballed numbers that I thought looked good.
Works.
Yeah. Which means that this parameter that the user uses is 0 to 1.
Yeah, so this is really made to help the final user using your node.
What's nice about this particular setup as well is we now have a single slider to control how noisy this information is. So if we turn this overlay off, we now have very clean cuts. And if we turn it all the way up, we have crazy noise. So even though I don't expose this to the user, I'll do this.
Yeah, sorry, Ben is on the French keyboard.
I've never used the French keyboard.
Yeah, so that's part of the fun.
So even though we're not exposing this to the user, you're still the user of your own graph. So simplifying the controls that you have to play around with is really important. So then for the opacity, this is then also exposed and modulated by the damage amount. So if the damage amount is very low, then it's only subtracting by a small amount. If it's the damage amount is very large, then we're doing a full subtract.
Okay.
So let's move on a little bit. So the next thing I did was add a little bit of surface noise. This is really subtle, so I'm going to turn this up a bit. Let's see. Let's try this. Yeah. So what I was after here primarily was these kind of lines along the ridges. What I had in mind was perhaps like casting errors when they were setting the concrete, or a bit of wear and tear, that kind of thing. But it's a very similar setup to what we saw with the chip damage here, where we basically have some kind of noise that's being, in this case, it's both adding and subtracting.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take a quick detour and explain why I'm using add sub here. And that's because if we think about this, hold on. What's going on? Ooh. Why is this not working?
Yeah, nothing is plugged out now.
Well, usually we get a second line through here.
Did we introduce the bug?
Impossible. It doesn't matter for what I need to explain, but so if you imagine this as your height map information, right? So we have your blacks down here and your whites up here. When you use something like overlay, and you blend in some information at the top, and then it perhaps like darkens the image. What happens is, as you get lower down the height map, and it starts blending in darker values, you start to have this curve shape, because the values will never go below 0.
Yeah.
And likewise, if you use an overlay and the values are quite bright, then it has this kind of curve shape, so you never go values above 1. Now that's like really useful for if you're doing stuff like roughness or that kind of thing. But the problem is that the information you define for your blends, it's going to behave inconsistently depending on where it's blending on the height map, which can be quite frustrating. So what you kind of want is that, so if I'm at 0.5 here in the height map and I just subtract like 0.2, I want it to subtract 0.2 at every point, so that here was the height information before, and now it's just subtracted 0.2 at every point.
Yeah, you don't want to distort the height information.
Yeah,
just to offset it.
So it just means that whatever this information looks like, I know it's going to behave consistently. And yeah, I don't want to distort it in any way. So that's the point of the add sub.
That's cool. I'm going to take some few questions
Yeah.
I have. One by Alice, but you almost answer it while doing it. It's when first working in Substance, what the first things to do, but I think the height map in your case.
Yeah, I definitely define the height map first. It's you can kind of think about it like modeling. You really want your forms and your shapes in there. I do find that I'll typically do a sort of pass on the height map, and then maybe like take it to sort of like a first pass, and then I'll do some color and roughness, and then I might find that, oh, this color information would be really good if it was also in the height map. So then I would like start doing a
second pass.
Yeah, but pretty much always it's sort of a rough sculpt, if you will, of the height map to get all the forms in.
And the second part was what would advise newbies to learn, for example. I could do once is go to Substance Academy, where we have a lot of free introduction Substance designer, which are made by Wes McDermott, and they're really good. So maybe, I don't know if you want to add on top of this some newbie pro tips, I don't know.
For me, I find the best way to learn is to just practice and try stuff out in the program. it definitely obviously helps if you kind of know the nodes. But that's exactly where the Academy is good for. Once you have a basic understanding of like what nodes are available to you, for me, just practice, just try stuff out. A lot of these kind of setups that we'll go through are derived from happy accidents.
Yeah,
they're things that I've just discovered over times.
Yeah, there is. That's one of the tricks. There is plugging nodes together is easy, but knowing how to plug them and knowing the nodes is a lot by practice, by taking the time to discover new nodes.
And I think I also get a lot of benefit out of breaking down other people's graphs.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you can find like a good video tutorial or something like that, those are great. But you know, they're often quite hard to find, or they cost money and this kind of thing. So, but loading up someone else's graph and really looking at it node by node, trying to understand what it's doing is incredibly helpful, because it forces you to think about what you're seeing.
Yeah, that's also why we invite some talented people like Ben, for example, because in Substance Source you have access to the graph, so you can dive into it and see how it works and get some inspiration from it. So, okay, let's move on.
Let's go back to this guy, because I kind of went off on a tangent here. So we were discussing adding this noise information. So I've got my noise data. The reason for the Grunge 013 is, again, just a happy accident. You know, I just kind of tried out the different noises, what I thought looked good. This was the one I happened to like. But right now it's, obviously if I just blend this on top, it's going to look like it's blended on top. So I offset the values by the pattern. And this is a very common technique. It's a directional warp, and you use the random grayscale map just to randomize and offset the pattern. So now every pattern shape will have a different information, and it doesn't look like it's just overlaid. So then I used the slope blur as a way to get these ridges. Now the slope blur, when it has really low samples, it kind of like breaks and adds all these artifacts, but that's exactly what I wanted. And the other benefit to having low samples is the slope blur is one of the most expensive nodes, but it becomes incredibly cheap when there's low samples. So I use this idea a lot of, if I need some kind of information that's dependent on the height, or you want to conform with the height, I use the slope blur with as low sample count as I can get away with. So you can see I've just got the height information plugged into the slope blur, and yeah, the sample count's incredibly low. But if we plug that in, you'll notice that you know, it's really sharp. This information is a bit too noisy.
Yeah.
So I then do another slope blur on top to just kind of soften that effect a little bit. Again, the Clouds 2 is just, I thought it looked good. Clouds 2 is like my go-to node for when it comes to slope blurs. It just produces really nice results. But this slope blur is also on an incredibly low sample count. And just to illustrate, if I increase this all the way up, like the difference is, you might not have even noticed that there is a difference. It's incredibly subtle, and the performance cost like balloons in comparison.
Yeah, this is something that generally many people don't look that much, but which is really important, is the performance. To get the same result at a cheaper price, performance-wise, it's really important.
Okay, so moving on. Yeah, let me set this back to what it was. So I then went on to add some more surface noise, and I'll do the same here, where I'll increase it so that we can see it a little easier. So here I'm adding this kind of like pitting, and what I was simulating here is, again, kind of errors in the cast or a bit of wear and tear. Perhaps these are like micro air pockets, that kind of thing. But it's the same idea. We have some kind of noise information with the histogram scan to control how much is visible, and then either an add sub or a subtract at the end. So again, we got our noise, we offset it by the pattern so that it's not a single overlay. And then in this case, I'm using the vector warp grayscale. This node does a very similar job to the slope blur, but I think I prefer it in many ways because it's, especially on the GPU, it's a lot quicker. And it tends to be a little bit more robust, like it won't break like the slope blur does.
Yeah, the funny thing is this one is the way you use it, because generally as a second input it takes a normal map.
Yeah.
But the normal map we use the green and red channel, so you make mostly your own channel with it.
So what I'm doing with the gradient map then is I'm just taking like this noise information that we used before, and then the colors I'm picking, these are representing, I have a black in here which shouldn't be there, there we go. These are representing vectors. So like this is an X and Y translate, this is an X translate, you know, this is just a Y translate, and this one's no translation at all. So I'm basically converting my noise information into a bunch of directions as a way to kind of distort and warp this information. But really the slope blur and the vector warp, I kind of use them interchangeably. They sort of, this node's the vector morph as well. So we've got the slope blur, and there's also the non-directional one that came in with the latest release.
Yeah.
Oh, we're actually in here.
Yeah, you have it.
Is it non?
This one is awesome.
Yeah. So like all these nodes, they produce like very similar results, but just a little bit different. So I tend to use all of them like interchangeably and just try them out to see which one looks good. So these are good ones to get used to. My main reason actually for using the vector warp here was because I knew this was going on Substance Source. So I wanted to, you know, illustrate more than one way of doing the same thing.
For the sake of education.
Yeah, that was actually my main.
You are a good man
behind this. So and that describes this kind of surface noise now. So let's set this back to what it was. I think it was 5 or 9. Doesn't really matter. Okay. So I then continue with adding some surface and damage. So this setup here was adding like these larger pits, which we can see, and this was to simulate again some larger like air pockets, or perhaps one of the stones in the concrete has chipped away, that sort of thing. Again, exactly the same setup, some kind of noise data, the histogram scan to control how much, and then subtracted from the height map. Here though, I'm reusing the noise information which we defined before. But the problem with this information here is there's a lot of like large whites and blacks. So if we were to take a histogram scan on this, as we start to increase this, we get like large pockets of damage, and I didn't want that. I wanted something more uniform and all over the material. So the high pass grayscale does a really good job of removing those large or those low frequency information and just preserve the details.
It's more uniform.
Exactly. So yep, that goes into the histogram scan. This is exposed to a parameter. Again, I modulate the value so that this remains a 0 to 1 slider, and then subtracted. So I then add, this might be very subtle to come through, I then add just a touch of surface information. And this is literally just some base over the entire thing, but it's on an incredibly low opacity. And the reason for this was just to make sure that there was never a perfect flat surface.
That's crazy. I told you last time, but the amount of time and energy you spend on small details like that, because it would look like a simple geometric form from far, but adding all this step adds so much life to it. That's really interesting. So
I then went on to add some more edge damage. This is adding like primarily on the actual edges of the shape. So I built a sort of custom generator to do this, and this edge damage is used across like all of the graphs. And this was one of the ways that I kind of went about trying to make sure that the set kind of looked cohesive. So every material is going to have like this kind of damage in it because it's using this node. So I'll quickly run through what the node does. Let's reset these to remove. Oh. And then we can discuss how it's put together. So yeah, there's a basic intensity slider for it with an amount control, so we can increase how much and how little. There's a sharpness slider on there just to kind of change the visuals of it. You know, if it's low, we get these kind of larger chunks. And then we have this height edge bias. So the way that you can visualize this is if this is set to height, then this amount slider uses the height information as a way of determining where the damage will be visible. So if we have the height map definition to 1, you'll see that no damage actually comes in on any of these like recesses. It's only on the peaks. If we turn the height map definition off, well, now the damage behaves just as like an overlay. So we can adapt depending of the way we think it could have been damaged by natural elements. Yeah. So now we start getting damage down in these recesses, which we weren't before. That's nice. Likewise, if we turn this up to edge bias, well, now the damage is really confined to the edges. If we turn down the definition, the damage is it's kind of larger and more. It's still confined to the edges, but it's a broader scale. If we increase the definition, now it's really on those edges. So we can jump in and have a look at how this node's put together. This is it's going to get quite heavy, so bear with me. Well, I'm here, Ben. I'm here. I'm going to turn on. Where is it now? Graph. Oh, it's already on by default. So if you turn this on, it means that we can now look in this graph and see the actual information, see the input coming in and what all of the data is doing. At its core though, it's the same kind of setup. We have some kind of noise. The clouds one in particular is it produces a very kind of stony feel, I find. But we have some kind of noise information. I'm then generating a mask from it. I'm using the distance node to produce this kind of carving effect. Okay. Then there's a bit of information here just to make it look good. That's just a slope blur and an overlay. But it's the same thing. We're then subtracting it from the height map. Now I'm actually using a multiply here. What? And that was I know that's like I keep saying don't use multiply and stuff, but in this case I just thought it looked better. Okay. And it just felt better when I was playing with the sliders. As it's an erosion, it's a bit more organic, so it would make sense that it's not perfectly offsetting. But it's the same core idea, some kind of noise that's subtracted from the height information. Okay, so the way that I'm controlling the amount this time is a little bit different. So if I reset this, get this set up so we can see what we're doing. So this is where thinking about the height information in 3D space on the histogram scan is really important. So we've got some noise information, right? So I'm then using an add sub with a uniform color as a way to shift this information up and down in 3D space.
Okay.
Then I'm using the histogram scan again to clamp these values and produce a mask. That's this guy here, right? This is also modulated, but we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's the same idea. We take the noise, we produce a scan, and now my uniform color is a way to push that information up and down in 3D space. So now we have a way to determine how much damage there should be. So we've got our noise. I'm using the high pass here, and again that was for the same reason of removing these broad whites and blacks. There's a switch here just to allow you to input your own custom height map if you wanted.
Okay.
And then this is exposed to the user as custom damage. The auto levels just ensures the values are 0 to 1. We got the blend to control the amount, and then I modulate that information again by either the height map or the edge damage. So we'll take a look at what that is. So this is where the height information is modulated, and you can see that this is just it's just a linear blend between either the height map or the edge information. So if this is 0, then it's using let's set this back to 1 so we can see it. Okay. So yeah, if this is 0, it's using the height map. If this is 1, it's using the edge damage. So let's discuss the height map. So the height information is just the height map coming in. I then do the auto levels again just to make sure it's 0 to 1 values. And then I'm using the histogram range as that definition slider. So if this is 1, it uses the height map in its full range, and then this goes into here. So if we run through an example, we've got the height coming in. This is 0 to 1. We're using the full range, so this is 0 to 1. We're saying use just the height map, which we then invert so that the tops are black, which then means that when we add and subtract this, then the tops of the height map are going to be black, which means that this histogram scan is also going to be producing black.
Okay.
So if I reduce the amount so it's not so crazy, that'll be a little clearer.
Yeah, that's interesting. You spend a lot of time really defining the zones where to apply
exactly.
the damages.
So then if we had the definition down to 0, now we have a height information coming in. This is 0, so this value is 0.5, which means this value is going to be 0.5.
So neutral.
Neutral, exactly, which means that the invert 0.5 is 0.5, and then when that modulates the noise information, because it's add sub, it means it has no effect. So then the behavior for this histogram scan is if it's just an overlay on noise. So that's the height map.
That was cool. Before you continue with the color, maybe, I don't know, you have a question from Alice again. What would be some of the things you need to know to be able to work in the field that you do? I think maybe not necessarily related to 3D, but in general. I'm just assuming. this is coming from a self-taught designer artist. So some of the stuff may be inspiration or.
Do you mean like in terms of what kind of subjects?
Yeah, I don't know if it's about photography or inspiration.
I actually found, so I used to be an environment artist primarily. That's like my background.
Okay.
And there I found that composition and photography is a great way to study composition, color, lighting. All of those are really important topics. So the kind of core art foundations still apply and still translate. So if you're going to study anything, it's that. Because I find that tools come and go, engines you use changes over the years. You could be really proficient in Unreal, but then you get a job and the company is using a different engine. So the core art skills is really what translates. As I translated more into material art, I actually found that math was a big part. Although it's incredibly artistic and you're dealing with color all the time, a lot of what we're doing here is manipulating numbers.
Yeah.
So you don't need deep math to do it, but having good understanding on how numbers are relating to each other, that kind of thing, that's I find really important. Yeah,
like the height map that you showed before on the histogram, to see how it blends, knowing having this graphic mathematical vision help for the blending, even if at the end it will be an art result. It's better if you know how it works underneath.
So okay, so talking about the edge modulation now. So again, if we set this this slider here to 1, it's now saying use the edge mode.
Okay.
So that setup is we take the height map, we auto levels again to ensure the 0 to 1 values, and I'm then generating a curvature smooth as a way to get the nice edge information. I take a levels to clamp the blacks out and only leave me with the highlights. So after an auto levels, it gives me just the edge highlights. And then that's the information we need to modulate with. This blend here is to transition between the different edge definition modes. And you can see that this is just a linear blend between a curvature smooth and a curvature sobel. I'm doing the levels here to crunch out the values. But the edge definition slider is just a transition between these two. So then one of the things that I noticed using this node on some of the other graphs in particular is this curvature information can get incredibly noisy and sometimes doesn't produce very good results. So I've got this edge width parameter here, which is just a blur that's exposed. And what that is doing is if we reset this now and blur this a little bit, I'm just blending it back on top with lighten. And that just means that there's a little bit of information here for the modulate to like chew on,
Yeah.
So this is a parameter that actually gets exposed under an advanced group. So because it's something that you would not necessarily want the user to play with, but it's something that you might need to get the node to behave well. So I do this kind of idea a lot of exposing parameters under an advanced group. Because these are settings that you need to have exposed in order to set up the node correctly for the input information, but you don't want the user to play with it. So it's at their own discretion. If they open this up and they change something and it breaks,
it's not your fault.
It's not my fault. So that's what the blend is doing here. And then after all this tweaking, I just do an auto levels again just to make sure that it's 0 to 1. And then that's the modulation. And just to recap, we have noise being controlled by an add sub with a uniform color to determine where it sits in 3D space. And then we modulate that noise by either the height information or edge information. We've got the histogram scan to produce the black mask. You distance it to create a carve-in, add some detail to it, and then multiply it on top of the height information.
Yeah, once again, really subtle, but it adds a lot at the end.
Okay.
I had a question from the truck's game designer. How do you know the scale of your texture in relation to the real world?
Unfortunately, I don't have it with me, but I at home and at work, I would build like a scale reference node.
Okay.
Where you would perhaps have like footprints that are a known size for a given texel ratio, and then you could just like plug it in, and then you would see the footprint in relation to your material.
Yeah, and also you have to know in Substance Designer, if you use the plane, for example, what we say is the width of the plane is 100 units. So after it depends what you are going to do, because it can be if you are doing a brick wall or if you are doing a ground, which is 2 meters, you have to adjust. But that's if you have to adjust the scale within the shader parameter, you can think of this using a plane and thinking that it's 100 units.
I covered this a lot actually in the GDC talk. Last year, because this was actually. So the high-res plane, as you were saying, is 100 units.
Yeah.
And if you assume those units are centimeters, this scale value, if that's set to 100, then
you have
this is a perfect cube.
Exactly.
So you can use that to work out what the scale value should be for your given like texture size. So when you're like actually on a project working for like a game or something, you would define a texel ratio, you would define what the like a common material would be, maybe it covers 2 meters or whatever. And that way you know what these values should be, so everyone can be working consistently. So can move on to, I then look to add a bit of debris. I'm going to adjust these settings so we can see this a little clearer.
I had another question for Kartik. What's the best way to avoid overlapping when using tile sampler, especially when creating? I think you more or less said it at the beginning. For this one, you had to tweak it by hand.
Yeah, I mean it's great to expose these parameters if you can, but a lot of to get it to behave correctly is quite a bit of work, because if let's duplicate this now. If I set this to something really high, like let's do like, here you can see the problem of managing these numbers now. Maybe this is like 46 or something. Oh no, it's even more, 64. Okay, you get the point. Now, let's get my working node again. See, now the problem with this is we still have, this amount of range, but it's not relative to the patterns. So now the patterns don't make any sense.
Exactly.
So if you're going to do like a really robust setup where you can change the pattern size and stuff like this, you then also have to account for the relative depth of things, which then means that all of these sliders are like inconsistent and relative. And that's one of the main reasons why I use the auto levels so much, particularly in this generator, right? Because the point of it is to be reusable, which means that I can't guarantee what information is coming in. So I have to ensure that the values are going to be 0 to 1 wherever possible. So that's why I'm using the auto levels quite a lot. Any kind of point where you need to have consistent numbers, use the auto levels.
Okay. Just want to say hi to Pauline Boiteux, who is in the chat and who is actually the author of the current version of Substance Designer splash screen. So hi Pauline, and
hello.
Yeah, really talented artist.
Okay, so debris. So you can see here what the debris is doing. It's adding these kind of like small bits of stones around the place. So the way that I went about doing this was I started with some Dirt 2. Again, this is just came out of playing around what I thought looked good. But the Dirt 2 had these kind of nice difference of scale in the debris, or like the stones. But there was a lot of like negative space. Right? We've got whole sections here where there's nothing happening. So I then translate that information and blend it back in on top on Lighten, and that just fills some of that dead space. And this is a nice cheap way of like duplicating data because you're reusing the same noise. So I then look to sort of inflate these stones a little bit. If you slope blur something by itself, you can get this kind of inflation effect. And you'll notice again, the samples are as low as I can get away with. But then we've got Histogram Scan again to control the amount. So let's just quickly look at that. So if we reset this, you can see it's the same idea. It's just a way to grow in and out the data. We can ignore this for now. We'll talk about this in a sec. But then I blend that on top. And again, I'm using another custom node to do this. This node I also went through in the Substance days in 2018.
Available on our YouTube channel. So
I'm not going to go into the details of how this is done because it's already available online. But I will quickly try and set up an example to show you what exactly it's doing and why I'm using it. Where did the height thing go? Oh, we've got loads of duplicate stuff down here. There we go. See if I can quickly set up an example. So typically, let's reduce the range of this. Typically you might have using something like a height blend as a way to blend in like stones and debris and this kind of stuff. Oops. And this node is great because it lets you basically have a slider here to control like how much you want to blend in data. But you'll notice that it blends in from the bottom up, right?
Yeah.
So it's ignoring the peaks on the height map. What the uniform add blend node is doing is adding that information like all over the height map. So it takes the height information from below into account when it's doing its blend. And then there's some settings to control how much, this kind of stuff. But then there's also this feature size slider which you can use to basically then simulate what the height blend's doing. So the reason why I like blending like this is because now I have a way to control the data more reliably, right? It takes the height information into account, so it makes the stones feel like they're sitting on the surface more. So one of the issues though with this is, well, now we've just got stones everywhere.
Yeah.
That's what I want to avoid. I want to have the stones in the recesses. So then it's like, well, okay, I can then just take the AO map from the height information so far, I generate an AO map from it, again with the auto levels to ensure that the data is 0 to 1. You'll
really
notice
small
that
sizes.
I've got a very small size because this node is really expensive. So we don't need all that information, so we just reduce it. I then invert it, which means that now our peaks are dark, so I can then just multiply them away. Now, this might seem a bit counterintuitive. I mean, if the point was to get stones in the recesses, why not just use a height blend? But now I have a slider that controls, I'll put this setup wrong. Let's invert these. Now I have a slider that controls how much the debris spreads within
From the
height
ground to the bottom.
And this is kind of what I'd like to emphasize about you are a user of your own graph. So as you're like building this stuff, mentally you're like, okay, well now I want debris like spread further. So I've set myself up to have a single slider that allows me to do this.
Yeah, it's valuable to spend a little bit more time now that you will save when using your final product.
And if you set yourself up like this, there's no reason why you couldn't expose this to the user if you wanted to. The reason I haven't is primarily just to keep the graph simple. So moving on to the next set of debris, you can see that it's adding these like little bits of string pieces, different shapes and such. But it's the same idea. We generate some data. I'm modulating it by the same AO map. We can ignore the warp for now. And then that gets blended on top. So to generate that information, I'm using the scratches generator. This is really awesome for creating like these strange organic shapes. So I use this a lot. Again, here you can see that I've exposed the debris amount to the user. Yeah, and then that's just added on top. So the warp then, let's see if I can find a good example, maybe here. Yeah, so here we've got a case of this debris is kind of just like going up against this edge here and it doesn't feel very natural. Well, what the warp is doing is just kind of like snuggling up that debris to make it feel or conform to the height information just a little bit. And that's achieved by just blurring the height information coming in. You'll notice again I've down-resed because we're blurring, we don't need all that information, and then just warping on a very low amount. So this just serves to snuggle the information. That's how I kind of visualize it. And that's it for the height map. So we can move on to the color now.
Just checking, there is no available question. Yes, there is one. Will the video will be is recorded? Yes, all our streams are recorded live on YouTube, so you can get access to it after. Just to give you an insight, which should have made like the 2/3, maybe. I know it's more like half an hour, 40 minutes, more or less more. So you know, it's really an in-depth one with a lot of cool information. No, that's fine.
To speed up.
We deal. If it's too long, Ben doesn't eat after. So no, but that's it. There is a lot of information, so we prefer to make it longer, but you get everything. So just so you know, we are still with you for quite a while.
So moving on to the color, one of the primary things that I wanted to achieve with this project was to have a nice and easy, consistent way of authoring color. I really like the color pickers as opposed to the HSL sliders or anything like that because it's way more visual. But the problem is with color pickers is to get good information you need like a ton of them, right? You have to be blending a whole bunch in. So what I looked to do was to generate these nodes here, which add, like for a given color, they will add some value variation or hue variation, and then I blend between them, and then kind of layer up this effect. So here you can see I've got the primary color. I then have a secondary color with the same setup. I'm generating some hue variation, some value variation, doing some blends and then blending between the two. So this gives us two nice sliders to use, and then the sample counts, which we'll get into, but the hue variation sliders, the value variation sliders, these are all exposed to the user and set on the same graph, to the same parameter, sorry. So if I increase the value variation, for example, we can get like a nice value variation, and then we can mix and blend between the two colors. If I set this to something crazy, we can see a bit more. And then maybe we increase the hue variation. You get the idea. All of this is driven by two parameters.
That's cool. That's actually really refreshing to see another way to tint and create base color, because generally it's true that we rely on a map and we will use like the gradient map only, and this is a cool way to do.
So we'll dive into how this node is set up. This is going to get a bit heavy. Okay, so the main idea behind this was to essentially build a color chart with the value and hue variation in it, and then use that to drive a gradient dynamic with some noise information coming in. So the way I went about that is I used a tile generator to generate, we can think of them as like sample points. So here we've got 16 samples because we're on a 16 by 16. I'm then randomizing those sample colors, or values, sorry, again with the order levels to ensure that it's 0 to 1. We can ignore the transform for now, but then I convert that to color, and then I just overlay it on top of the input color. And there we go, we have our color chart with random variation for the value. So this transform then is, I've exposed the offset as a seed. And that gives us a way to randomize the value samples. So you can see as we offset this stuff, it will just cycle through and essentially randomize the values on the color chart. The reason why I've done this is because a common problem you might have is by default, when you change a random seed on a node, it's going to change the look of everything. Yeah. Which is incredibly frustrating if you spend time getting your color to look good and then suddenly you change the seed and then everything is different. So you'll notice that the random seed here doesn't work, and that's because I've manually locked it out.
Yeah, it doesn't rely on random color basically.
Exactly. So on the where is it? I'm not sure where it's gone now.
The transform now?
Oh no, it's on the, sorry, I kind of skipped a step. So to randomize the values, I'm using a white noise with a gradient dynamic. And then the white noise here, I've locked the random seed to a single value, which means that this graph, like this noise, will never randomly generate whenever you change the seed value. It's locked.
Okay.
So to generate the samples, I just expose the X amount onto the for the user. But one of the problems is that if we're now limited to 16 samples.
Yeah.
If we want more samples than that, then this texture is too small to hold that amount of information. So I'm also modulating the output size based on the sample count. So as we increase, Here, I'll go in here and simulate that. So let's add an integer here. Let's do something like 6. As I increase the sample count, you'll see that it's dynamically increased the output size to accommodate for the extra sample points. So that's the value variation. The hue variation has exactly the same setup, in that we generate some sample points, we randomize those values, the auto levels, to ensure it's 0 to 1. And then I'm blending between 2 different colors based on the original. So the idea I had for this was taking the color, and then what I really want to do is basically shift the hue either side, right?
Yeah.
And then I could shift this amount based on these intensity of these samples. So what I've done, if we go into the hue here, I've basically exposed how much to shift. I then modulate that value. Just this number came out of because it looked good. And then actually this is not used, so we can, this is just came from experimenting. I had an idea and never used it, so I can ignore that. And then I just add a value of 0.5, and that's because by default a value of 0.5 has no effect.
Okay.
And then I do the same for the other HSL node, except I subtract, so it goes the other way. I then blend between those 2 colors based on those sample points. Now, one of the problems I ran into is, so what happens if your color has like very low saturation? Like, what does it mean to have hue variance for a color that has no saturation? So I didn't want to have the nodes, you know, when you increase the hue variation, have no effect. So for that reason, I force the saturation to 1 on both of the colors, and then I'm blending it back in to the original color, and then expose the opacity of that as the hue variation. This is then blended in based on just an offset version of the sample points.
Okay.
So that a mix of the original color is still mixed in with the hue variation. And then the nice thing about this kind of 2-stage setup is you can also expose the blend modes. So for some colors, maybe soft light looks good. For some colors, maybe overlay, that kind of thing. So then that's the hue variation. The reason why there's 2 separate generators to produce the sample counts is because I found that hue variation tended to look better when there were more samples versus the value. So if we have a look in here, we've got the samples and we're just adding a value of 3 on there.
Yeah, cool. There is Simon who is asking, how do you randomize the samples? And by the way, wonderful survey, Ben. So Simon Tartar, who is a super good artist as well.
So I'm randomizing the samples with the gradient dynamic. So I'm using basically, like these are a linear blend, right?
Yeah.
Which I'm also assuming to be sample points. And then the gradient dynamic is just reading some noise information. And
the noise, the random is stuck on, is locked on the on the noise. So it means that even if you change another random value, it won't change the rest.
So this is locked permanently. And then instead, if you do want to randomize the values, you use the exposed seed instead. And that's just to ensure that when you random seed the parent graph, this doesn't change. So then the other thing that I kind of discovered sort of working with color is that, well, now I've got value variation, now I've got hue variation. Sometimes I want to have a particular map drive hue and another map drive value, because at the moment, you know, there's only one input. But sometimes you want the same input for both. So what I've done is expose that on a multi-switch. So in the top, we have the value variation, the hue variation with the value variation blended on top. So this is like a combo of both of them. That goes into the first input. We then have only the hue variation and then only the value variation. And then, yeah, that's exposed to the user so that they can pick which mode they want. So that builds us our color chart. So just to kind of recap, the main idea, take some samples, randomize them, use that to offset the hue and the value to build a color chart, which then drives a gradient dynamic.
That's really cool.
So if we have a look at, again, to kind of, now that we've gone through this, to summarize how this is put together. So I have my uniform color. I'm using that to drive some hue variation, some value variation, and then I blend between those two in yet a different map. And then there's two of these setups for primary and secondary to then blend between those colors.
That's really cool. Especially for, once again, let's say simple geometry at first, it gives a really interesting base color.
So looking at how I generated the actual noise maps to drive these color nodes now, it's largely just coming from the height information.
Okay.
So here I've got my random grayscale. I'm also using the sort of gradient noise information, and these are blended again with add sub to make sure that I'm not distorting any of this data. Here I'm blending in some of the that roughness, the surface detail, and then more of that surface detail. So this is all coming from the height map. Now how I prefer to blend stuff is kind of like an average blend where I have individual sliders. So if you imagine, we've got like 4 sets of data coming in here. How I would like to blend this is basically add up all this information and then divide it by 4. So I have a nice average of all of them. But then I want sliders to control how much each effect should be in. So that's what these histogram ranges are doing. They're basically just ensuring that the add sub, the collective add sub at the end of this chain is always going to be within 0 to 1.
Okay.
So this value here is 0.5 divided by 4. And then that's across all of them. So regardless of how I blend these, it's always going to be in 0 to 1, and then I auto levels to make sure it's at the end. And what this setup gives us is basically now we have a slider to control how much surface or height information should be present in the color. So if I set this off, then this effect has no impact on the color. And it's totally independent of the height information. So because I'm using the actual noise itself, even if I set this off or really high, it won't change the color. And likewise, I could introduce this into the color and it won't change the height, but it's still the same information. So then the output of that is driving both the primary color nodes. For the secondary color, I decided to base it off the height map. So in here I have the height map coming in. This transform 2D is just kind of like a pass-through node because I wanted to keep the graph nice and tidy, and I wanted it to be clear that this was the height map. So this transform is doing nothing other than to make the graph look good. But then I'm generating a curvature smooth to give me some nice edges. And then I'm just blending in that height information so far. Here's the auto levels again to ensure 0 to 1 values, and then that's going into the secondary color.
Okay, to blend them too.
Now the other nice thing about basing your masks off like height information is this histogram select mode. So I'm using that as a way to like blend through the height map. And this is a really nice way of blending between the two different colors. So yeah, I just exposed the position slider for the user here, and also the contrast. And let's see if I can't give an example of that. Let's set something crazy here so we can see it. So here, we're just blending through the height map, right?
Yeah, it feels really natural.
So the whole end result of all of this was just to give us two color pickers with a value variation and a hue variation and a means to slide that data through the height map.
That's pretty interesting. We always say that generally the more time you spend building your stuff and maybe sometimes adding some complexity to your graph, for the final user it means that if you do it well, you have less parameters to drive your effects.
And this whole setup is largely based on the fact that I love taking the gradient map, you know, and then kind of dragging to get some samples from your ref. But of course, this can't be exposed, so you're locked into these colors. So I wanted this, but procedural. That's where this whole setup
this is awesome.
From. So we can move on now. So I then just continue to colorize the rests. Here I'm just colorizing the surface damage. I'm just taking the different maps. I add them together, and then here I'm only just doing a value variation, and the color it's using is the original primary color. And then that's just blended in. And then for the debris, it's even simpler. I even actually just used a gradient map to give me some values, and that's based off, again, the stone data. But the problem is that if the user selects something crazy, you know, these colors might not match. Like if you've got pink bricks, then you probably don't want brown stones. So
we want pink.
So I've also got a gradient dynamic which is based off the color information, and then I blend between the two, half each.
Okay, so it feels more natural regardless of
so even if the user selects a crazy color, at least the stones will kind of match. And then that's set up for both types of debris. We have the color information, some stuff sampled from scans, and then blended in. I'm then using the dirt node as a way to add some dirt on top. And I really like this node. I use it a lot. The only thing that's kind of particular with this setup is I have duplicate versions of the Ambient Occlusion and Normal node, and that's because the ones we're using for the outputs are exposed to the user, and if the user sets intensity to super low, you know, then we don't want that to affect the dirt that we've set up. So we have these nodes separate, and they're not tied to any exposed parameters. But other than that, it's just the dirt. I take some color, I generate some values and blend that in. And here I'm blending it in on like 50%. I then take a bit of curvature information, blend that in on add sub with very low value, just as a way to kind of punch the volume a little bit. And then we check the albedo values just to make sure everything is fine. All this setup here is stuff that's needed for Substance Source. So these are the technical parameters that you see on every graph. Yeah. So you can change the overall hue and saturation, blah blah blah.
We try to be organized.
So then for the roughness, I like to base my roughness off my color wherever possible, because you spend so much time getting the color to look good that you also want the roughness to correspond to that. So the general approach I took for this is to take color at various points through the graph I convert it to grayscale, auto levels to give myself the full range again. And then this is overlaid on top of a single color, which is exposed to the user. So now they have a means to change the overall roughness of the graph. To help if I set the outputs. And then I also expose the opacity on the overlay so that there's a means to control the variation.
Okay.
And you'll notice now that I'm actually using the overlay. And that's because in this case, I do want to make sure that the information never goes below 0 or 1. I want to make sure that this information is relative to the data coming in. So I then start blending in some more information from the height map. Here I'm taking some of that grunge surface pitting. I just eyeballed the levels to what I thought looked good. Blend that in on screen. This is also tied to the roughness variation and modulated by a value which I thought looked good. I then add in those the larger surface pits. And then I blend in some more kind of surface information. This is a nice setup that I tend to like with roughness, where I'll take some data from the height map, in which case it was this guy, and then run that through a facing normal node, and that kind of gives you like up vectors. That kind of gives you the stuff that's pointing towards you. And it's just like a nice way of adding. I just like the effect it gives.
Yeah, that's a good trick.
And so then that's blended in on overlay, again modulated by some numbers that I eyeballed. And then this setup just repeats. So we have our stones, grayscale conversion, overlaid on top of some color, and blended in. Likewise, grayscale overlaid on top, and then blended in. And then I blend in the dirt on the screen. And then I did a very slight sharpen as a way to just kind of crisp up the effect. And that's it, that's the entire graph.
That's awesome. I think you deserve to eat first tonight, so
Yeah.
which is great.
Excellent.
I'm going to check. Maybe we are going to put our face because we're so handsome that they deserve to see us. I think so. Sorry about this. It's a bit okay. Here we are. So I'm going to move a bit the microphone, so it's a bit more professional. So if you guys have some questions, that's the right time. Thanks a lot first, Ben, for all this. You have access to, if you are subscriber, from Substance, you have access to the graphs on Substance source. So all of them are crazy and they're crazy interesting. So if you want to learn about how to do this, that's a good exercise to open them. Get scary at first, but take the time to really look step by step what's going on. And I'm going to look if there is some question. First, Pauline is saying that you can eat as well, so that's a good thing.
Okay.
I don't have any question. I'm just browsing to make sure we didn't forget everything. There is Kartin who asked for portfolio review. It could take a bit too much time, but that's actually a really good topic for a next video. I think inviting someone and opening few portfolios and just making make a live review. I think we are good, so thanks a lot for watching. Once again, this stream is recorded, so it will be available just after we stop it. So thanks again, and have a good day. So I'm going to put a nice image. Bye bye.